My dad called me a failure and an uninvited loser at my brother's celebration. But his own CEO exposed a secret that changed everything. He had no idea that I secretly owned his company and his entire world was about to collapse. I'm Ethan, 28 male, and my father just humiliated me at my brother's party, only for his own boss to call me sir and expose a secret I've kept for years. It's funny in a tragic sort of way. For more than a decade, I've been the ghost in my own family, a footnote in the grand story of my younger brother, Kevin. To my father, Robert, I was the perpetual disappointment, the living embodiment of failed potential. To my mother, Helen, I was a source of quiet, anxious sighs, a problem she hoped would eventually solve itself. But in that one earth-shattering moment, as the CEO of my father's company stood to greet me with a deference no one in that room could comprehend, the world didn't just shift on its axis. It fractured, and all the carefully buried truths came spilling out. My life has been a tale of two realities. In one, I was the quiet kid who never quite measured up. In the other, the one I built for myself in the silence of my apartment and the glow of a computer screen, I was building an empire. My family only ever saw the first one. The favoritism wasn't a secret. It was the central organizing principle of our household. Kevin was the sun around which my parents orbited. His achievements, no matter how small, were cause for celebration. I remember when he was 12, he won a flimsy plastic trophy for most improved player on his soccer team, a team that lost every single game of the season. My father had the trophy professionally mounted on a wooden plaque and hung it in the center of the living room wall. That same week, I won the statewide mathematics competition. When I showed my father the certificate and the modest check that came with it, he glanced at it for a moment before setting it aside on the kitchen counter. "That's nice, Ethan," he'd said, his eyes already drifting back to the television. "Just make sure you're not spending too much time on that computer stuff. You need to be well-rounded like your brother." The certificate ended up getting stained by a coffee mug and was eventually thrown out. The plastic soccer trophy is still there to this day. Then there was the matter of money, which was always a clear barometer of worth in my father's eyes. When I was 16, I worked all summer at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and stocking shelves to save up for a better computer. I had a little over $1,000, a fortune to me at the time. I kept it in a small lockbox in my closet. A week before school started, my parents sat me down. Kevin's class was taking a trip to Washington, D.C., an essential educational experience, my father had called it. It was expensive and they were a little short. They needed to borrow my savings. "It's an investment in your brother's future," my father explained, as if that made it my responsibility. My mother just looked at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "We'll pay you back, sweetie, I promise," she whispered. I knew it was an empty promise, but I was 16, I gave them the money. Kevin went on his trip and brought me back a cheap keychain. I was never paid back. I built my first custom PC with salvaged parts and free software. The biggest point of contention was always my passion. While Kevin was out playing sports or socializing, I was in my room teaching myself to code. I was fascinated by the logic, the infinite possibility of it. To my father, a man who believed success was forged in handshakes and office politics, my world was alien and worthless. "You're wasting your life in that dark room staring at a screen," he would say, standing in my doorway with a look of profound disapproval. Look at Kevin. He's out there learning about people. That's what gets you ahead in the real world. He saw my passion as a character flaw, a retreat from the world he understood. He couldn't see that I wasn't retreating, I was building. Every line of code was a brick, every algorithm a blueprint for a world he couldn't even imagine. The irony, of course, is that the real world he so admired was about to be fundamentally reshaped by the very computer stuff he so openly disdained. And I was going to be one of the architects. The invitation, like most things concerning me, was an afterthought. It wasn't a call or a crisp envelope in the mail. It was a text message from my mother a few days before the event. "Kevin got his promotion at Innovate. We're having a small party for him Saturday at the house. Dad's boss will be there, just letting you know." There was no "we'd love for you to come" or "hope to see you there." It was a statement of fact, a bulletin delivered with the same emotional weight as a reminder to take out the trash. The underlying message was clear. This event is happening, it's important, and it has nothing to do with you. You are, as always, peripheral. I stared at the message on my phone, the blue light illuminating my face in the quiet of my minimalist apartment. My first instinct was to ignore it. Why would I voluntarily walk into the lion's den? Why would I subject myself to an evening of thinly veiled insults from my father, syrupy praise for Kevin, and my mother's anxious, fluttering attempts to keep a peace that never truly existed? It would be an exercise in self-flagellation. I could already picture the scene. I would walk in and the conversation would dip for a moment. My father would give me a curt nod, his expression screaming, "Why is he here?" Kevin would offer a smug, pitying smile. And I would spend the evening standing in a corner, nursing a drink, a living ghost in my own family's celebration. I typed out a reply, "Thanks for letting me know, I'm busy Saturday." My thumb hovered over the send button. It was the easy way out. It was the path of least resistance, the one I had taken so many times before. It was self-preservation, but something held me back. Maybe it was a flicker of hope, a foolish, stubborn belief that this time might be different. Or maybe it was something else, something closer to pride. Why should I be the one to hide? Why should their dysfunction dictate my life? I had spent years building a life for myself entirely separate from their judgment. I was successful. I was independent. I was happy. Why did the thought of a 2-hour party still fill me with such a profound sense of dread? I thought about my mother. I knew deep down that her passive text was likely a weak signal of her own internal conflict. She probably wanted me there but didn't have the courage to say it, to stand up to my father's inevitable disapproval. Showing up would, in a strange way, be a gesture for her. A sign that I was still trying, even when they made it almost impossible. But there was another, more compelling reason forming in my mind. The text mentioned that my father's boss would be there, Mr. Harrison. The CEO of Innovate Corp, my company, eVentures Capital, had finalized the acquisition of a 51% controlling stake in Innovate Corp just 3 weeks prior. It was a silent acquisition, handled through layers of legal and financial firms to keep my identity as the new majority shareholder private. My father, a mid-level manager, had no idea. To him, the company had been bought by some faceless East Coast investment firm. The thought of being in the same room as my father and his boss, my employee, was a scenario laden with a sense of cosmic irony that was almost too rich to pass up. I wasn't planning a grand reveal. That wasn't my style. But the private knowledge of it felt like a shield, a secret armor I could wear into battle. I deleted the text I had written. I took a deep breath and wrote a new one. Sounds great, I'll be there. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The reply came back almost instantly, a single emoji, thumbs up. On Saturday evening, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I had chosen my outfit with care, not a suit that would be too aggressive, too out of place. Instead, I wore a pair of dark, well-fitted trousers, a simple, high-quality gray cashmere sweater, and a classic leather-banded watch. It was an outfit that whispered quiet confidence, not one that screamed for attention. It was the uniform of a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who didn't need to peacock. Driving to my childhood home, a wave of familiar anxiety washed over me. My hands felt clammy on the steering wheel. I passed the park where Kevin's soccer team had lost all their games, the grocery store where I'd worked my fingers to the bone for money that was taken from me. Every street corner held a memory, a small ghost of past slights. I had to consciously slow my breathing, reminding myself that I was no longer that powerless teenager. I was not the person they thought I was. I was showing up tonight not as their failed son but as myself, and that, I decided, would have to be enough. The street was lined with cars, more than I'd expected for a small party. I recognized some of them as belonging to my father's colleagues, people I'd met in passing over the years who always looked at me with a polite confusion, unsure of where I fit into the gleaming narrative of the perfect family Robert presented to the world. I found a parking spot a block away and walked, the cool night air doing little to calm the frantic beating in my chest. As I approached the house, the sound of laughter and music spilled out from the open windows. It sounded so cheerful, so normal. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd be happy to see me. The hope evaporated the second I stepped through the front door. The living room was crowded. My father was holding court near the fireplace, a glass in his hand, laughing loudly at something one of his work friends had said. My mother was bustling around, refilling bowls of chips. Kevin was standing near the center of the room, looking proud and a little self-important, surrounded by a small group of admirers. The moment I entered, it was as if a cold front had moved through the warm, cheerful atmosphere. The conversation nearest the door didn't just dip, it died completely. A few people turned to look at me. I offered a tight, polite smile. I saw my mother's head whip around, her eyes widening in what looked like panic. She started towards me, a nervous, jerky movement, but my father saw me first. His laughter cut off abruptly. His face, which had been ruddy and jovial, hardened into a mask of pure annoyance. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as if I were some unwelcome stranger who had wandered in off the street. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't try to hide his disdain. He wanted everyone to hear it. He wanted everyone to know that I did not belong. "What's he doing here?" The words boomed across the room, slicing through the music and chatter. Every head turned towards me. I was frozen in the doorway, pinned by the collective gaze of 24 people. The air crackled with a sudden, horrible tension. My father took a step forward, his lip curling into a sneer. He looked over at my mother, who had stopped dead in her tracks, her face draining of all color. "Helen, I thought we agreed. He was not invited." The public declaration of the word uninvited was a deliberate twist of the knife. It wasn't just that I wasn't welcome, it was a formal decree. He was branding me an intruder in front of his friends, his colleagues, his boss. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. My hands, clenched into fists in my pockets, began to tremble. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I wanted to turn and run. My mother just wrung her hands, stammering, "Robert, please, not now." Kevin, my brother, just stood there. He wasn't laughing, but a small, smug smirk played on his lips. It was the look of a victor, of someone who had been proven right. This, his expression said, is exactly where you belong, on the outside looking in. My father wasn't finished. He snorted a loud, derisive sound. Look at him, can't even get a real job, but he has time to crash his brother's party. What is it you do all day, Ethan? Play on that computer of yours. A few of his cronies chuckled nervously. No one knew where to look. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to defend myself, to tell him off, to just ask him to stop. But my throat was tight, the words trapped behind a wall of humiliation. All I could manage was to meet his gaze, my own eyes burning with a mix of fury and unshed tears. This was it. This was the reason I stayed away. This was the reality of my relationship with my father. It wasn't just neglect, it was an active, venomous contempt. And then from the corner of the room, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the toxic silence. Excuse me. The voice didn't belong to a family member or a friend. It was deeper, more measured. Everyone turned towards the sound. An older gentleman, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer, was rising from an armchair near the fireplace. He had graying hair, a kind but serious face, and an aura of effortless command. I recognized him from the Innovate Corp company profiles. It was Mr. Harrison, the CEO. My father's expression shifted instantly from aggression to fawning deference. Mr. Harrison, is everything all right? Can I get you another drink? Mr. Harrison ignored my father completely. His eyes were fixed on me, and they held an expression of complete and utter surprise. He took a step forward, his movement silencing the last of the whispers. The whole room held its breath. And then he spoke the words that would bring my father's world crashing down. Sir, I didn't expect you to attend in person. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than the hush that had followed my father's outburst. Before, the silence had been thick with my humiliation. Now it was brittle with confusion. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart. My father, Robert, froze mid-stride, his sycophantic smile plastered on his face. His brain seemed to short-circuit as he tried to process what he had just heard. He glanced from his boss, Mr. Harrison, to me and back again. The gears were turning, but they were grinding against a reality he could not comprehend. Me, sir? It didn't compute. My mother, Helen, who had been pale before, now looked like a ghost. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding that something monumental was happening, something far beyond the scope of their petty family drama. Kevin's smug smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of slack-jawed bewilderment. Mr. Harrison, seemingly oblivious to the domestic bomb he had just detonated, walked directly towards me, extending his hand. His expression was one of genuine, respectful surprise. It truly is an honor to meet you, sir, he said, his voice resonating with sincerity. I'm James Harrison. We've spoken on the phone, of course, but I never imagined I'd have the pleasure of meeting you under these circumstances. I finally found my voice, my throat still tight. I took his offered hand. It was a firm, dry handshake. Ethan, I said simply. It's good to put a face to the name, Mr. Harrison. Please call me James, he insisted. He then gestured vaguely around the crowded living room. I must confess I'm a bit confused. Robert, he said, turning to my father, who looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, you didn't tell me you were related to our new principal investor. The term principal investor hung in the air like a guillotine. It was a corporate phrase, a bit of jargon, but in that room, to those people, its meaning was starting to crystallize. My father's colleagues, who had been snickering moments before, were now staring at me with a mixture of awe and fear. They understood the hierarchy. They understood what that title meant. My father could only stammer. An investor? I don't understand. This is my son Ethan. He doesn't have a... He trailed off, the words real job dying on his lips. The insult he had hurled at me moments ago now sounded utterly ridiculous. Mr. Harrison's brow furrowed. He seemed to finally sense the immense tension in the room, the undercurrents he had inadvertently exposed. He looked from my father's horrified face to my own deliberately neutral one. Your son? He asked, a flicker of realization in his eyes. He lowered his voice slightly, though everyone was still straining to hear. I see, I was not aware of the family connection. I know you only as the managing partner of eVentures Capital. eVentures Capital. The name meant nothing to my parents or my brother. It was the name of the holding company I had created, the legal entity that now owned 51% of Innovate Corp. It was the source of my wealth, the culmination of a decade of silent, relentless work. To my family, it was gibberish. But to James Harrison and to every single employee of Innovate Corp in that room, it was the name of their new boss. A woman standing near my father, whom I vaguely recognized as someone from HR, let out a small, audible gasp. eVentures, she whispered to the man beside her. That's them, that's who bought the company. The whispers started to ripple outwards, spreading the information like wildfire. The dots were connecting in real time in front of everyone. My father stared at me, his face a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, disbelief, denial, and finally a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. The disappointment son, the one who played on his computer, was in fact the mysterious, powerful figure who now controlled his career, his livelihood, his entire professional world. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. The years of disdain and condescension were still etched on his face, but they were now competing with a new, terrifying emotion: fear. He had not just humiliated a guest at a party. He had not just insulted his son. He had, in the most public and spectacular way imaginable, humiliated himself in front of the man who held his future in his hands. Mr. Harrison, a man clearly adept at navigating awkward situations, gave a small, diplomatic cough. "Well," he said, offering me a tight, professional smile, "this is certainly a surprise. Perhaps we could schedule a proper meeting at the office next week. There's much to discuss about the Q4 projections." "Of course, James," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "My assistant will be in touch to set something up." I held my father's gaze for one long, silent moment. I saw it all in his eyes: the collapse of his worldview, the shattering of his pride. The power dynamic which had defined our entire relationship had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of an earthquake. I was no longer the boy begging for his approval. I was the man he now had to answer to, and in the chilling silence of that room, we both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The party was over, not officially, of course. The music was technically still playing at a low volume and people were still holding their drinks, but the life had been sucked out of the room. The air was thick with unspoken questions and the palpable shock of what had just transpired. The small groups that had reformed were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, all of them casting furtive glances in my direction. I was no longer an invisible ghost. I was the elephant in the room, and the room was shrinking by the second. My father remained frozen near the fireplace, a statue of crumbling pride. His face was ashen. He looked 10 years older than he had 10 minutes ago. My mother was hovering near the kitchen entrance, wringing a dish towel in her hands, her eyes darting between me and my father, looking utterly lost. Kevin had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, leaning against a wall and staring at his shoes, the life of the party now a sullen, forgotten footnote. Mr. Harrison, ever the professional, saw that the situation was unsalvageable. He gave me a knowing look, one that communicated a deep and immediate understanding of the profoundly awkward position he was in. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and discreet, "my apologies. Had I known, well," he gestured vaguely at the scene, "I think perhaps it's best if I take my leave." "I understand, James. Thank you for coming," I said, my voice equally quiet. It felt like we were actors on a stage, performing a scene of corporate civility while the set collapsed around us. "We will speak next week," he said, giving me a firm, final nod. He then turned to my father. "Robert, Helen, thank you for the invitation." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked briskly to the door and let himself out, escaping the toxic atmosphere he had unintentionally brought to a boil. His departure was the signal for a mass exodus. One by one, my father's colleagues and friends made their excuses. "It's getting late," one would say, avoiding my father's eyes. "I have an early morning," another would mutter. They all gave me a wide berth as they left, some offering a slight deferential nod in my direction, a gesture of respect that felt bizarre and alien in the context of my childhood home. Within 15 minutes, the crowded, noisy room was nearly empty. Only the four of us remained: me, my father, my mother, and Kevin. The silence that descended was no longer brittle with shock, but heavy with the weight of 20 years of unspoken resentments and freshly exposed truths. I knew I couldn't stay. There was nothing to say, not yet. The wounds were too raw, the revelation too new. To speak now would be to unleash a torrent of anger and pain that would help no one. I needed space. I needed to breathe air that wasn't saturated with my family's dysfunction. I turned to leave without a word. "Ethan, wait." It was my mother's voice, thin and trembling. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob but didn't turn around. "Please," she whispered, "don't go." I finally turned to face her. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression pleading. "Why?" I asked, and the simple question carried the weight of 1,000 other questions. "Why should I stay? Why did you let this happen? Why was it never enough?" Before she could answer, my father spoke. His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. "Let him go, Helen," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. He couldn't look at me. "What's the point?" The defeat in his voice was absolute. This was not the boorish, arrogant man who had humiliated me. This was a broken shell. Seeing him like this, I felt a strange and unwelcome twinge of pity, which was quickly smothered by a fresh wave of anger. He wasn't sorry for how he'd treated me, he was sorry he'd been caught. I didn't say goodbye. I simply opened the door and walked out into the cool night. The drive home was a blur. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. There was a fierce, undeniable current of vindication. The part of me that was still that 16-year-old boy who'd had his savings stolen, the part that was still that academic champion whose achievements were ignored, was screaming in triumph. I had won. I had proven him wrong in the most definitive way imaginable. But beneath the vindication, there was a profound and aching sadness. This wasn't how I had wanted to earn my father's respect. I never wanted to have power over him. I just wanted him to see me, to acknowledge my worth as his son, not as his boss. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the fact that it took a display of wealth and power to make him finally look at me. When I got back to my apartment, the silence felt different. It was no longer just peaceful, it was a sanctuary. I walked over to the large window that overlooked the city skyline. The endless grid of lights represented a world that I understood, a world of logic and systems where effort and ingenuity yielded tangible results. It was a world I had mastered. And yet, I had just been reminded that all the success in the world couldn't fix the simple, primal hurt of a family that didn't love you for who you were. My phone started buzzing on the counter. It was my mother. I ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again, my father. I stared at his name on the screen, a name that had only ever appeared to deliver a criticism or a demand. I rejected the call, then a text from Kevin, "We need to talk." I turned the phone off and slid it into a drawer. The reckoning would come, I knew that. But tonight, for the first time, I felt like I would be the one to decide when and on whose terms it would happen. For 2 days, I lived in a self-imposed bubble of silence. I kept my phone in the drawer, letting the calls and messages pile up, unread and unanswered. I went to my office, a sleek modern space downtown that my family didn't even know existed. I held meetings, reviewed portfolios, and spoke with my team. I immersed myself in the world I had built, a world where I was respected for my mind and my decisions, not for my lineage. It was a necessary balm for the soul, a reminder of my identity outside of the toxic role I played in my family. By the third day, I knew I couldn't postpone the inevitable any longer. The silence was no longer a shield, it was an avoidance tactic. I retrieved my phone and saw the predictable barrage of notifications. Dozens of missed calls from my mother, a handful of hesitant calls from my father, and a string of increasingly desperate texts from Kevin. I decided to meet them, but not on their turf, not in the house that held so many painful memories. I texted my mother a single sentence: "Meet me at the cafe on Elm Street tomorrow at 10 a.m. All of you." It was a neutral ground, public enough to discourage a full-blown screaming match, quiet enough for a serious conversation. I arrived first, choosing a corner booth that gave me a clear view of the entrance. I ordered a black coffee and waited, feeling surprisingly calm. The dread that had preceded the party was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. The power dynamic had been permanently rewired. I was no longer coming to them cap in hand, seeking approval. They were coming to me seeking, what? Forgiveness, understanding, a job. They entered together, a grim, united front. They looked out of place, rumpled and anxious. My father, who had always carried himself with an unearned swagger, now seemed smaller, his shoulders slumped. My mother's face was puffy from crying. Kevin trailed behind them, his usual arrogance replaced by a sullen resentment. They slid into the booth opposite me. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said for years. My mother broke the silence, her voice watery. "Ethan, we are so sorry." "Sorry for what specifically?" I asked, my voice even and calm. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I needed to know what she was actually apologizing for. Was it for my father's outburst? Or was it for the 20 years of behavior that had led to it? She faltered. For what Robert said, for the party, it was horrible." "It was," I agreed, taking a sip of my coffee. "But it wasn't new, was it? It was just louder than usual." My gaze shifted to my father. He was staring at the tabletop, tracing the wood grain with his finger. He still couldn't look at me. "Robert," I said, using his first name. It felt strange, but Dad didn't fit anymore. "Do you have anything to say?" He finally lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was a mask of confusion and humiliation. "I don't understand, Ethan," he rasped. "How E-Ventures, that's $1 billion fund, how is that you?" And there it was, not an apology but a question born of disbelief. His first concern wasn't the pain he had caused, but the logistics of my success. He still couldn't reconcile the son he had written off with the man sitting in front of him. So I told him I didn't embellish or boast. I laid out the facts in a calm, dispassionate timeline. I told them about the small web hosting service I started in college with the money I earned from freelance coding gigs. I told them how I sold that service for a modest but significant profit. I told them how I used that seed money to invest in 2 small, unknown tech startups that my research told me had huge potential. I told them how one of those startups was bought out by a major tech giant, turning my initial investment into a small fortune overnight. And I told them how I leveraged that fortune to create eVentures Capital, a firm dedicated to finding the next generation of promising, undervalued tech companies. Innovate Corp, I concluded, was one of those companies. It was fundamentally sound but poorly managed at the executive level, chasing short-term profits instead of long-term innovation. My firm acquired a controlling stake to change its direction. As I spoke, I watched their faces. My mother looked on with a kind of tearful awe. Kevin's resentment deepened into a sour, jealous glower. My father just looked broken. The entire narrative of his life, his belief in his own real-world savvy and my foolish immaturity had been dismantled piece by piece. "Why didn't you tell us?" my father asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would I?" I responded, the question genuine. "When have you ever shown an interest in my computer stuff? When have you ever offered a single word of encouragement? You made it perfectly clear that my world was a disappointment to you, so I built it without you. My success isn't something I achieved because of your tough love, it's something I achieved in spite of your constant disapproval." The truth of the words hung in the air between us. "So what now?" Kevin finally piped up, his voice laced with bitterness. "Are you going to fire Dad? Are you going to fire me?" I looked at my brother, the golden child, now reduced to worrying about his entry-level job. "That's what this is about for you? Your jobs?" I shook my head, a sad smile touching my lips. "No, Kevin, I'm not going to fire you. I'm not my father. I don't use my power to punish people I don't like. Your careers at Innovate will be based on your performance and your merit, nothing more, nothing less. For the first time, you and Dad are on a level playing field." I turned my attention back to Robert. "I don't want to be your boss, Dad," I said, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "I have people for that. I'm the owner. What happens at the office stays at the office. But what happens here," I gestured to the space between us, "has to change. The humiliation, the insults, the belittling, it's over. It has to be. I am not your failure anymore. The question is, can you have a relationship with me as an equal, as just your son?" My father stared at me, his eyes swimming with a complex mix of shame, regret, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long, long time: respect. He slowly, hesitantly nodded. The conversation was far from over, but it was a start. It was the first honest conversation we had ever had. The old foundation had been demolished. Now we had to see if anything new could be built on the rubble. The months that followed the confrontation at the cafe were quiet and strange. The dynamic of our family, once a rigid and unchangeable hierarchy, was now a fluid, uncertain thing. The old roles were gone, but new ones hadn't fully formed yet. We were all walking on eggshells, learning a new dance. My father, Robert, underwent the most dramatic transformation. The boisterous, condescending patriarch was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost timid man. Our phone calls were stilted and awkward. He would ask about my work using corporate terms he'd obviously looked up, trying to speak my language. "How are the Q4 deliverables looking?" he'd ask, the question sounding unnatural in his mouth. It was a clumsy, imperfect effort, but it was an effort nonetheless. He stopped offering unsolicited advice and stopped comparing me to Kevin. He started, for the first time in my life, to listen. He didn't lose his job. In fact, freed from the bitterness of his own perceived stagnation, his performance at work apparently improved. He was still my father, but now there was a new, fragile layer of respect in our interactions, a respect born of power perhaps, but one that I hoped could one day blossom into something more genuine. My mother, Helen, tried to bridge the gap with an almost frantic energy. She called constantly, not with passive-aggressive texts, but with actual calls to hear my voice. She'd ask about my day, my apartment, if I was eating well. She was trying to fill a 20-year void of maternal affection in a few short months. She apologized relentlessly, both for my father's actions and for her own inaction. "I was a coward, Ethan," she told me one day, her voice thick with tears. "I was so afraid of his anger that I let his bitterness poison this family. I'll never forgive myself for that." I didn't absolve her with a simple, "It's okay," because it wasn't, but I did tell her that I appreciated her honesty. Her attempts to reconnect were sometimes smothering, but they were sincere, and for that I was grateful. Kevin had the hardest time adjusting. His entire identity had been wrapped up in being the good son, the favored one. With that status gone, he was adrift. For a while he was sullen and withdrawn. He had to stand on his own 2 feet at Innovate Corp without his father's influence, and the reality of being just another junior employee was a harsh wake-up call. But slowly, painstakingly, he began to change. He started talking to me not as a rival, but as a brother. He asked me about my early struggles, about how I started my first company. He was seeing me not as the family failure, but as someone who had achieved something he now found himself aspiring to. Our relationship is still a work in progress, but the toxic rivalry has faded, replaced by the tentative beginnings of a real sibling bond. The story doesn't end with a magical, heartwarming reunion where we all sit around the dinner table, laughing and sharing stories as if the past never happened. The scars are still there. There are still moments of awkwardness, still sentences left unsaid. The hurt of a lifetime doesn't vanish overnight. But what we have now is a chance. We are building something new on the ruins of the old. It's a relationship based not on a broken power dynamic, but on a hard-won, clear-eyed reality. My success forced a reckoning that should have happened years ago. It shattered the comfortable lies my family had told themselves in. D forced them to see me and each other for who we really are. I learned that self-worth is a fortress you build for yourself, brick by brick. It cannot be granted to you by others, and it cannot be taken away by them either. My family's approval was something I once craved more than anything, but in its absence I found something far more valuable myself. The greatest irony is that by letting go of the need for their validation, I finally, unexpectedly received it. The future is unwritten, but for the first time, it feels like we might just be able to write it together. So for anyone out there who feels like the outcast in their own family, who feels unseen or undervalued, my message is this: don't wait for them to see your worth. Go out and build your own world. Your success, your happiness, is the only validation you will ever truly need. The rest has a funny way of falling into place when you least expect it. After listening to today's story, perhaps it has raised some new questions in your mind. Every day on Reddit, new experiences and moments create fresh stories. We are all human. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share it. Thank you for your time, and don't forget to keep an eye out for more stories coming soon.